Welcome back to History by Lynny. I'm Lynette. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the relationship of Isabeau of Bavaria, who was Queen of France from 1385 to 1422, and her husband, King Charles VI of France, the man who thought he was made of glass. Isabeau was born in Munich in 1370. Her father was Duke of Bavaria, one of the more powerful states of that time. Born Elizabeth, she took on the name Isabel once in France. The name Isabeau is said to have come from the nickname given to her by her ladies-in-waiting. She was described as a small olive-skinned brunette with a pointed nose and dimpled chin, and she took after her mother's Italian features. At 14 years of age, her uncle began toying around with the idea for her to marry Charles VI, the King of France. He ascended the throne in 1380 when he was just 11 years old. Although the idea of the union had been brought up in 1383, it was not until 1385 when the young couple met. Some have written that Charles chose Isabeau out of 3 other brides that were proposed to him because her portrait was the most beautiful. Prior to their meeting, her father had Isabeau get to know the ways of the French court in order to make the best impression to Charles and the court. She did not speak the language yet, but she began to dress the part by changing her typical Bavarian-style dress to what was more in style with the fashions of France. In July of 1385, Isabeau continued on her journey to France to be presented to the king. Now, the problem here was that Isabeau had no idea she was going to France to be presented as a bride. It was customary during this time for a bride of the king or prince to be inspected. She exhibited perfect behavior, standing motionless as she was being inspected, and it's reported that at the time of their first meeting, Charles felt happiness and love enter his heart, for he saw that she was beautiful and young, and thus he greatly desired to gaze at her and possess her. Just 3 days after meeting, at the age of 16, she married the 17-year-old king in a lavish wedding. The intended date had been planned for later, but it seems as though Charles just couldn't wait to make Isabeau his queen. Isabeau was known to be quite the beauty, but she wasn't the only attractive one in the relationship. Charles was described as equally attractive and was very fit. He enjoyed physical activities such as riding, jousting, and hunting, and would even take part in tournaments. The day after their wedding, he departed for a military campaign against the English, and Isabeau was sent off to the north of France with her step-great-grandmother, Queen Blanche of Navarre, where she learned more about the courtly traditions and essentially how to be a queen. Later that year, she took up residency at the Château de Vincennes, where Charles would visit her regularly. Although they married in 1385, her coronation did not happen until 1389. Her coronation was a grand affair and far more lavish than their wedding, with no expenses spared. Hundreds of spectators lined the streets as Isabeau made her way into Paris. Carried upon a golden litter, she wore a silk houppelande embroidered with gold fleur-de-lis. The huge procession included nobles, all dressed in expensive and lavish clothing made with threads of gold and adorned with jewels, and her sister-in-law alone was escorted with at least 1,000 knights into Paris. The streets of Paris were also lined with the Parisian bourgeois on horseback, wearing suits of green and crimson baldaquin cloth. The roads themselves were covered with ornate carpets made of silk and camlet, while windows of houses were decorated with elaborate tapestries. Fountains flowed with milk and wine, and performances were held throughout the procession for entertainment. At the entry to Paris, when Isabeau reached an arched gateway decorated with a starry sky and children dancing around a figure of God, symbolizing the gates of paradise, 2 men dressed as angels were hoisted up above her head, bearing a jeweled crown. As she passed through, the angels were lowered and placed the crown on her head, declaring her Queen of the Realms of France. With this performance, it was meant to show Isabeau being crowned and welcomed into Paris, just as Mary was crowned Queen of Heaven and welcomed into paradise. Isabeau was now a mediator between the French citizens and their king. Things didn't just end there. There was more to come as she went through the streets of Paris to Notre Dame. Flags with her new coat of arms showing the union of France and Bavaria flew from trumpets, and children dressed as angels sang as they made their way into Notre Dame for the ceremony. The festivities lasted 5 days with feasts and pageants, and the citizens of Paris presented Isabeau with a table covered with an expensive cloth of gold in hopes that the arrival of the new queen would bring an opportunity to lower taxes. But the opposite happened. In order to pay for such an extravagant coronation, taxes were raised just 2 months later. The couple was said to have had a deep love for each other since the moment of their marriage. Isabeau was actually 7 months pregnant during her coronation, and it's said that she nearly fainted and became weak from the heat on the first day of the coronation. They had 12 children together, 6 sons and 6 daughters. However, not all of them made it to adulthood. Charles loved to spoil her with lavish gifts like jewels and clothing, and one of those gifts he gave her was a red velvet saddle for her horse decorated with their initials. Isabeau often received criticism for her overconsumption and love of fashion and extravagant things, but she didn't just use her clothing as fashion statements, but as political statements as well to show her power and status. She was also accused of having spent through her kingdom's wealth and bringing on financial woes. But not only did Charles love her and love to spoil her, he also trusted her to take part in politics, often acting on his behalf during his absence. In 1393, Charles chose Isabeau to be the regent and co-guardian of the Dauphin, which was shared between Louis of Orleans, Philip of Burgundy, and her brother Louis of Bavaria. Isabeau was also made primary mediator between Louis and Philip, as well as regent of the kingdom. The following year, Isabeau became the leader of the Regency Council, giving her power over the royal duke. Much of this power that was transferred to Isabeau was due to her husband's illness. On August 5th, 1392, at the age of 24, Charles suffered a psychotic episode, or his first attack of what they called insanity. According to records, as Charles traveled with his army, he became distressed when a page dropped a lance and caused a loud noise. Charles drew his sword, attacking several of his men, including his brother Louis. 5 of the men were killed in the attack, and witnesses stated that his eyes rolled back and he was delirious, not even able to recognize his brothers and uncles. His next episode did not occur until about a year later and would continue more frequently for the rest of his life. He would go in and out of bouts where his behavior changed. He was often incoherent and inappropriate, and also suffered from paranoia and hallucinations. He would run through the halls of his palace claiming he was being pursued, causing the need for them to board up the doors and windows in order to keep him inside. He refused to bathe or change his clothes for a period of 5 months, and at one point in all of this, thought he was made of glass. Charles demanded he have iron rods sewn into his clothes so that he would not shatter. Isabeau stayed by his side through all this, and they would even sleep in the same room together during his bouts of insanity. Some of their children were conceived after his episodes began, but most likely during his moments of clarity. As the years went on and his illness progressed, Charles became more and more violent, including with Isabeau. It was a difficult time for the young queen, so much so that she felt she had to remove herself from the palace. During this time, it's also said that Isabeau may have approved of a mistress for her husband. Being as though he could barely recognize her anymore, she would have the mistress, who did resemble Isabeau somewhat, wear her clothing, and Charles never suspected a thing. Isabeau continued to pray for his healing, even consulting with magicians, and she donated money on their behalf, but in the end, none of that helped. It's possible that Charles had suffered from a serious illness prior to his first bout of insanity or schizophrenia, likely typhoid, which causes inflammation of the brain, and his mental disability was likely a result of complications of that original illness. Charles died in 1422 at the age of 54, never recovering, and Isabeau died in 1435 at the age of 65. Both are interred at the Saint Denis Basilica outside of Paris. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel, be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any videos. Thanks again, and I will see you next time.